Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the premiere of a new segment that did not exist before, but it's about to exist. We're going to talk about philosophy with a friend of the stream. His name is EcceFatum. He's been on the path of philosophical inquiry for 17 years. His emphasis is in ethics and political philosophy. Basically, he knows way more about this stuff than I do, so it's going to be kind of like Agent Smith, where it's more of the host-expert relationship. I will weigh in with a little bit of the neuroscience, cognitive science angle on some of this stuff. But mainly, it's a time to learn. Time to learn and a time to discuss. We did kind of deliberate back and forth between each other about how we wanted to approach this and tackle this in a way that would be beneficial to everyone. It is assumed that the vast majority of people who watch my channel and would hear this know less about philosophy than, we'll say on average, someone who's studied it for 3 or 4 years. So this is going to be more for the layperson rather than philosophy experts duking it out, so to speak. So you don't need to feel intimidated. If you're confused by anything, don't hesitate to ask. I will be reading the chat during this. EcceFatum will not. So if you have questions, you can ask me, and you can be a part of the conversation. We don't need a question person, as per Agent Smith, because I will not be playing StarCraft until we are done with this. So yeah, this is a new concept of a segment, but I'm looking forward to it. We do have Lily in the chat, who's quite learned in the ways of philosophy, so if you have any expert knowledge you can help us with, that's cool too. That's cool. But yeah, without any further ado, let's get it rolling. I would like to announce Mr. EcceFatum for this first fantastic episode. What is up, sir?
Hello.
Hello.
Excited about the new content. Not just because it will be me talking, but I'm looking forward to hear others talk too. Philosophy is such a beautiful subject, and as you said, you can go on for ages talking about it and never get anywhere.
But yeah, it's refreshing for me as well, because sometimes you get trapped in the video game vortex where all you do is ladder and all everyone wants to see you do is ladder. So we've had some other discussions on the stream recently which have encouraged me to reach out to you and try for this, because I think there is the morale aspect of learning something new. Oftentimes just increases your vitality and your excitement to be in the world. You want to discover things and stuff like that. So I'm looking forward to this. And I did say we were going to focus on a few of the Greeks to start things off, since we're basically going to take it from the beginning with this philosophy of mind discussion.
Yeah, so I'll be talking about the probably most famous three Greeks, being Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And they're considered the founders of all of Western philosophy, since they had their hands in basically all the discussions that are going on up until now are somewhat versions of the discussions they were having back then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
to give people a little bit of context here, if you think about the development of the human species, it wasn't really possible for someone to be a career thinker until agriculture, just based on how much food output you have. So it's going from hunter-gatherer society, where basically every person in the tribe either hunts stuff or gathers things. And at the end of the day, you've all done physical labor and you make it through. Whereas with these Western philosophers we have among the Greeks, they do have agriculture, which means you have specialists who can dedicate their lives to things that are not just gathering immediate resources for consumption. So that's when they have lots of time to think about stuff.
yeah, that's correct. Basically, all the Greeks we will be talking about today are aristocrats, so they had enough leisure time to basically do nothing else than think about stuff in weird ways.
Yep, and it's the thinking and the writing that allowed it to stand the test of time. So kind of going
Exactly.
beyond the oral tradition, but also documenting.
And yeah, back then philosophy was different as it is nowadays. Basically, when we think about philosophy today, we're thinking of a really specialized um, field of knowledge where a lot of people have a lot of things to say, normally in weird ways too. So it's intimidating for people. But back then, philosophy was everything. Every time they got together and just basically rambled with ideas. That was philosophy back then. So I want to keep it in that spirit and don't talk about what they felt was right or wrong, but rather talk about on how they approach these subjects and how they had discussions about whether this is correct or the other thing is correct. One important thing to know about the old Greeks is that they almost never claimed something to be the one truth or the things the way things are. They rather all their dialogues or all their texts are written in dialogues, so it's always a discussion whether this is correct or the other one is correct. And they normally end in, well, basically, we're just as wise as we were at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a humility there for the vastness of the problem and the difficulty in finding a clear solution. And I think this is partially related to one of the notes that you had in the outline, which was the rationalism versus empiricism, which is reasons versus measurement, and how philosophy isn't really a hard science in the sense that you have clear quantities of stuff that you can poke at and measure and kind of see how things change. A lot of it is it's kind of stuck in the terms we have in language to use to describe the problem.
Yeah, exactly. And to kind of start off the conversation or to demonstrate how big the problem with language is, the word mind is not a term we normally use in German. So we have different concepts that relate to mind. So there's a bunch of different words that would come back when we translate it back and forth, being consciousness, also the senses, intellect, viewpoint or opinion, notion or thought, the psyche, or even the soul. So all these combined kind of make up the German translation of mind. And all of these are kind of different aspects of the mind that are worth talking about and that philosophy talked about in length. Consciousness was something that only came into discussion really late, so it's a already very thick concept, which we're probably not going to touch on in terms of views of philosophers, but things like the senses or intellect come up quite a lot in the discussions back then.
Yeah, one of the topics that's already popped up, and I kind of knew this was an inevitable aspect because it's one of the points of consciousness that I think your average person talks about fairly often, is free will. Do you believe in free will? And how that's a very weighty question if you want to really dive into it. From the neuroscience perspective, that's one that's been challenged fairly recently, in that free will isn't perhaps as clear-cut as we thought, but it's more of a deciding potential. And for anyone who's pursued education, this is one of the amazing and yet kind of unsatisfying aspects of reality, is the closer you get to solving a problem, the more you realize there's another tangled web at the end of that that you have to kind of unpack. So from my perspective and what we've been using in cognitive science and neuroscience, instead of thinking about free will as a yes or no question, you think about deciding potential, which is more like a how much free will are we talking about in this situation. So you're not necessarily picking a side, you're talking about how much agency you can exert as a thinking person in the world, and how that varies based upon you and based upon your situation. It's complicated. And I think with philosophy, you probably have a really great familiarity with this, is you can't really expect to carry on a line of questioning and then end with something that was a really satisfying answer. A lot of times you just move toward another really unsatisfying situation.
That's kind of true. The problem of free will has been around for almost all of philosophy, and a lot of thinkers said a lot of things about it. So I'm just going to give you my personal view on it, which is basically that we'll never know whether or not we have free will or not. But for almost all other questions in philosophy, like ethics or politics, it's better to assume that we have free will, because otherwise all of that would not make much sense anymore. If we're following a line of hard determinism, everything's just already rolled out for us, and it doesn't make any sense to be talking about it.
Yeah, so that's the practical side, which you could say that even if an organism doesn't have, quote, free will, for a society, a nation, civilization, it makes sense to still have responsibility within that person. So maybe you're not in full control of your actions, but if you are presenting a danger to society, it makes sense to mitigate that with you as the source of it, rather than just let everyone run amok and do whatever they want to. So I think for the practical side, things would remain pretty much the same either way. I tend to, on an existential kind of spiritual side, I tend to think positively toward agency and responsibility, and trying to practice your power of will to do this or that, to take a challenge that you don't necessarily have to try something new, such as a philosophy segment on your StarCraft stream.
I think that's a good way of looking at it. So I'm not quite sure what's happening, but my computer is doing some weird things with Discord, so I hope I just stay connected. But I can't send you the link I wanted to send you on Discord, so I'm just going to post it in chat. And this would be like a small introduction to the fundamental problems of free will. And it's part of a movie, Waking Life.
I've seen this movie. This is a good one. Okay,
yeah.
I can just play this then. This is 3 minutes 15. You want the whole thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. We'll mute the lovely campfire. Okay. This button. Okay.
In our contemporary worldview, it's easy to think that science has come to take the place of God. But some philosophical problems remain as troubling as ever. Take the problem of free will. This problem's been around for a long time, since before Aristotle in 350 BC. St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, these guys all worried about how we can be free if God already knows in advance everything you're going to do. Nowadays, we know that the world operates according to some fundamental physical laws. And these laws govern the behavior of every object in the world. Now, these laws, because they're so trustworthy, they enable incredible technological achievements. But look at yourself. We're just physical systems too, right? We're just complex arrangements of carbon molecules. We're mostly water. And our behavior isn't going to be an exception to these basic physical laws. So it starts to look like whether it's God setting things up in advance and knowing everything you're going to do, or whether it's these basic physical laws governing everything, there's not a lot of room left for freedom. So now you might be tempted to just ignore the question, ignore the mystery of free will. Say, oh, well, it's just a historical anecdote, it's sophomoric, it's a question with no answer, just forget about it. But the question keeps staring you right in the face. Think about individuality, for example, who you are. Who you are is mostly a matter of the free choices that you make. Or take responsibility. You can only be held responsible, you can only be found guilty, or you can only be admired or respected for things you did of your own free will. So the question keeps coming back, and we don't really have a solution to it. It starts to look like all your decisions are really just a charade. Think about how it happens. There's some electrical activity in your brain. Your neurons fire. They send a signal down into your nervous system. It passes along down into your muscle fibers. They twitch. You might, say, reach out your arm. Looks like it's a free action on your part, but every one of those, every part of that process is actually governed by physical law, chemical laws, electrical laws, and so on. So now it starts to look like the Big Bang set up the initial conditions, and the whole rest of our history, the whole rest of human history and even before, is really just sort of the playing out of subatomic particles according to these basic fundamental physical laws. We think we're special. We think we have some kind of special dignity, but that now comes under threat. I mean, that's really challenged by this picture. So you might be saying, well, wait a minute, what about quantum mechanics? I know enough contemporary physical theory to know it's not really like that. It's really a probabilistic theory. There's room, it's loose, it's not deterministic. And that's going to enable us to understand free will. But if you look at the details, it's not really going to help, because what happens is you have some very small quantum particles, and their behavior is apparently a bit random. They sort of swerve. Their behavior is absurd in the sense that it's unpredictable, and we can't understand it based on anything that came before. It just does something out of the blue according to a probabilistic framework. But is that going to help with freedom? I mean, should our freedom just be a matter of probabilities, just some random swerving in a chaotic system? That starts to seem like it's worse. I'd rather be a gear in a big deterministic physical machine than just some random swerving. So we can't just ignore the problem. We have to find room in our contemporary worldview for persons, with all that entails, not just bodies, but persons. And that means trying to solve the problem of freedom, finding room for choice and responsibility, and trying to understand individuality.
Nice. That's good. There was a lot in that. He goes pretty fast. But yeah, one of the aspects that jumps out at me with that he didn't quite discuss is, where is our agency and where is our consciousness? And this kind of relates to our discussion in general, and is probably the thing that I can add into most with the neuroscience background. And that is, if you're looking at the development of our nervous system, the parts of ourselves that we would say are the most uniquely human are our prefrontal cortex. So the front of our brain is the most recently evolved, and it's the most distinguished from other animal species. So a lot of our critical thinking, decision-making, planning, personality, those complex higher order functions, the way that we think in words and stuff like that, it's very heavily concentrated there. So if we're talking about free will, the question isn't just whether we have it, it could also be where it is. Where in our body, in our physical self, is our agency? Because you don't have free will over your gut activity, over different physiological systems. A lot of those are effectively automatic to us. They're just run by the machine. Our brain can influence some of it, like you could hype yourself up and increase your heart rate, or you could deliberately choose to breathe in a certain way. But if you expand free will versus determinism in those ways of how much do we have and where is it, it just, I think, illustrates the complexity of the problem.
Yeah, that's a really great way of putting it. I think it's interesting when you look at what we know about the brain and where things happen. So basically we have the most reptile part of the brain where our fight or flight responses are located. And then there's like everything besides the frontal lobe that's kind of what we presume animals have too, like emotions are being handled there, all the inputs from our senses are handled there, but also all the mechanical stuff happening within our bodies are somewhere controlled in that part of our brain. And interestingly, only parts of it, as you said, make it into consciousness. Like we're not realizing that we're constantly pumping blood or that we're moving around for the most part. It's something that's unconscious to us, but you can bring it into consciousness and then say, all right, reach out or say something. So there's parts that are going on underneath, and there's parts that are going on with our control, basically. And how these are located is a really interesting question.
Yeah, and that actually brings up an interesting point, which is the total amount of sensory experience within our bodies and what we perceive with sights and sounds and all this is more than we're usually processing in our current conscious picture of the present moment. Basically what I'm saying is, from the point where the sensory information goes from your eyes, your nose, your mouth, your ears, to your brain does a bunch of work omitting certain things, saying that this isn't super important. It alters certain things to make them more helpful for you, and it simplifies things to make them more digestible for your current experience. So some examples that you have, and you have different psychedelic substances that can change the way the brain prioritizes stuff. Some stuff jumps out at people as being super vibrant and wild. A lot of it is just some of those inhibitions of the brain, some of those omissions not taking place, so the information is really dense. So the question then is, why would the brain omit stuff? Because more information is better, right? Not necessarily. You also have a limited cognitive firepower capacity. You only have so much you can process at a given time, and we are evolved to survive as hunter-gatherers in the wild. So if you're just totally amazed by the geometry of the leaves on the trees, the bear is just going to come out of the woods and eat you. You have to pay attention. You have to have kind of a sober and streamlined conscious state to be able to succeed and to thrive and live in a very dangerous circumstance, which is nature. Nature's scary, so the brain is adapted to be a sort of smart survival mechanism. It's not just the pure like truth-seeking device of the cosmos. Like, we're trying to seek truth and we're trying to make sense of our surroundings with the brain now in a sort of post-hunter-gatherer society, but the brain was evolved for hunter-gatherer survival, so we need that context when we're thinking about how it takes in information and processes it.
Yeah, this brings up an interesting point on how much are we still the same as we were when we were hunter-gatherers. So basically, the old question, nature versus nurture, whether it's that we're more influenced by society, by our surroundings, on how we perceive things or how we prioritize things in our thinking or our senses, or is it still more based on DNA and how we evolved as a species?
Yeah, well, the natural response for me as well, it's both. Why does it matter which one is in first place or second place? They're looking for the percentage values, I guess, of how impactful is each one. But yeah, we are nature plus nurture. That is who we are in the present moment.
Absolutely agree. I think kind of as we're going through different concepts, if you have some background on how these percentages go, that'd be really interesting. Like when we're looking at language being all nurture, but there's like how we, like basically everything that's happened with our senses is probably mostly nature. So we're not even sure about whether or not color blindness, for example, is something you pass on with your DNA.
I think you can. I think it's a recessive gene that comes up. I'm not a geneticist, but I believe it is hereditary to a capacity. Like you have an increased chance to be colorblind if you have ancestors who are. And this is a good time for the disclaimer that Agent Smith usually does, which is we're not right about everything, so if you have corrections, just go ahead with that. We're not expecting to be sharing the gospel truth to everyone. We're just trying to have a conversation and talk about different stuff. So I am reading the chat during this. If we say something wrong, just let us know and we can factor it in and move forward.
Yeah, so, I think back to the Platonic dialogues, it's not about being wrong, it's about having a good conversation. It doesn't matter where you end up. It's important that you had a good time doing it. So in terms of the different brain regions, like, do you see free will or consciousness only happening if you have a frontal lobe, or do you see animals as having something resembling consciousness as we know it?
I think animals have a lot of the different parts of it, because you can think about the different elements of consciousness. And actually, this may be a good time to show the diagram from the paper that you sent me, just so people have a nice visual aid for this. So consciousness, to break it down, it's not just a off-on of do you have consciousness or not. As a preface to this, we haven't scientifically defined what consciousness is. By using philosophy and neuroscience and psychology, we're trying to tackle the problem from different angles, but it's an unsolved problem. So if anyone tries to tell you what they think consciousness is and that they're correct about it, they're probably making stuff up. So here's the diagram we have here. You notice the axes of this are the level of consciousness, which is how awake you are. And then the y-axis, the vertical, is the content of it, which is how aware you are. So you have stuff at the bottom left, which is basically barely being alive and conscious, coma, and general anesthesia. And then you've got deep sleep coming up a little bit. REM sleep, you have more awareness in your REM sleep. You notice the dreams are more vibrant and stuff. Lucid dreaming is when you realize you're dreaming. Vegetative state would be you can still be fully awake, but you don't really have any awareness. Minimally conscious. This paper fleshes out a lot of the details of these: light sleep, drowsiness, locked in, and conscious wakefulness. But yeah, you're asking about animals and the consciousness they represent. I think of it as different aspects of our experience. So for example, cows have a best friend. If there are a bunch of different cows in a herd, they'll tend to favor someone who they just enjoy sitting next to. They don't have language for the complex conversations that we might entertain, but there is still a sort of favor and an enjoyment of another person's company there. Dogs can identify different words and respond to different commands, and they have loyalty and stuff. They're oftentimes sacrificial when it comes to looking after the people around them and stuff. You can tell that they feel shame if they've done something wrong and you've called them out and pointed out their mistake and stuff. So if you're thinking about the total range of the human conscious experience, a lot of that you would say animals get to experience basically fully. It's not always going to be described in the terms of language that we use all the time, but things like friendship, things like betrayal, theft, using tools to solve problems, communicating with sounds and whatnot. I think there's a lot more overlap than we think. A lot of times people will think about humanity as a totally transcendent species where we're just above everything else, whereas I think of it more as by the process of handing down information, so language from one generation to the next, we're able to snowball our intellectual progress across generations. And it's exploded into agriculture, civilization, all this different stuff. But basically, we had just enough of a cognitive edge to be able to get smarter across generations. That is by the information that we can pass on. So if you're weighing just the raw cognitive firepower of us versus other animals, there are some other ones that are very reputable in their own right. So elephants are incredible. Playing piano and stuff, there's a really cool documentary on that. It's not as good as a human playing piano. Elephants have they're just huge. It's hard to play a piano. Then you've got the other great apes who are genetically the most similar to us. So chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, stuff like this, orangutans. And then a lot of the marine mammals are very smart as well. You've got the orcas, killer whales, dolphins, other whales, and things like this. And the one that I think surprises a lot of people are some birds. So crows, ravens, things like this have been demonstrating they have a lot of memory for how to solve problems. They work together well in groups. If you're a human who has wronged them, they'll remember you for the rest of their lives, kind of a thing. So consciousness, I think, is pretty widespread across the living species of the planet. Again, it's the question of how much consciousness and what types of conscious experiences are these animals experiencing? But obviously they can go all the way up the wakefulness capacity. The animal is awake, it can flap around, it's alive. The awareness, I think, adjusts some. And to add in a little bit, there are some things that other animals are aware of that we're not. So examples would be stuff like different wavelengths of light, different frequencies in the sound spectrum. We just don't even physically register those. So certain insects, certain monkeys, and other kinds of animals can see or hear or taste or smell, like in the example of dogs, different things that we can't. So in a way, they have a conscious edge on us in certain capacities as well. The one that we really shine in is the informational capacity, so the complexity of what we can talk about and communicate with words.
Yeah, so two things I want to talk about there. First off, there's been studies on how much thinking or consciousness relates on being able to talk or based on language. And the conclusion was that basically that everything we need for survival is our thinking mechanisms that are outside of the realm of language. So we can get hungry without having a word for it. We love someone without needing a word for it, or basically everything we do that's historically there doesn't need a word for it for us to think about it. Where we need words and where words are such a beautiful concept is when we get to a level of abstraction, where it's not just something you necessarily be able to point towards and say, all right, this is an apple, because an apple is self-explanatory. But if you're saying society or mind, you're using words that are so abstract that we need something to point towards to have a common definition in order to talk about it. Mm-hmm. So basically the need for language gets higher with the level of abstraction where you to make up concepts or to generate new ideas.
Yeah, it can also really compound the level of detail for a certain thing. So an example would be the difference between using a simple tool like a hammer to bang something versus having a blueprint for an architectural plan to create a massive structure that has a bunch of different moving parts, and how language and designs and things like that really increase the amount of, I guess, the scale of what we can build.
Yeah, there's some similarities there to coding languages, where with every new language you have a bunch of different stuff within one simple command, so you don't have to write everything out. Every time you use it, you could just put a new command that has all the old ones in it. So basically, as we're making up more terms, taking together different other terms, we're adding to complexity, but we're also dumbing it down to some degree, where we're making it easy to talk about one thing that incorporates a bunch of different ideas without needing to talk about each one of them. So like mind. We're having this concept of mind that is so many things tangled together that we don't have to talk about each one of them and just, I have in mind that I want to go out now or something. It's an established idea, so it makes it a lot easier for us to talk about it. And yeah, as to the sensory input you talked about, where animals basically have an edge on us for some input, we're slowly catching up with that. There's been some studies made with sensory substitution. Basically, it was giving people a vest with electrons in it, and there's a specific algorithm that I think it was used both for visual aid or for hearing aid. So you have someone talk to them basically, and the vest gives up a specific signal to the body. And once you wear the vest for about a week or two and kind of get different input on what was said, you start to get a sense just by wearing the vest of what was said. So we can substitute senses that are gone with other sensory input, which is a pretty amazing feat of our brain.
Mm-hmm.
And it works for visual input as well. So you can be blind, but when you're wearing the vest, you get a sense of the room you're standing in or what's in front of you.
That's pretty awesome.
And when I heard about this, they also talked about this being potentially used to give us new sensory inputs, like feeling a magnetic field, or what's the other one that bats do?
Echolocation.
Yeah. So we're at a point where it's possible to give us new senses by using the input mechanisms we already have to, and it needs some training for the brain to be able to properly implement them into our thinking and to know how to interpret them. But at some point we'll be having X-ray vision, for example.
This basically links into one of the primary concepts of neuroscience, which is neuroplasticity. And the engine of change for a given brain and a given mind is that as it takes in information, the networks between the neurons will adjust and adapt over time to be more efficient and to find more elegant solutions to these problems. So your brain is physically changing with your experience, and that's pretty amazing. So you do have that aspect of not only are you going through life and seeing different things happen, you're learning new stuff, the cells in your brain are sort of finding those new connections and realigning to do better at it over time. Flip sides would be stuff like trauma is also mechanically wired into the brain as well. So if you've had bad experiences, that is physically changing a lot of these networks. So yeah, neuroplasticity is a very powerful process that we're still trying to understand exactly how it works. Other different angles you have for understanding this would be things like how plasticity changes through the aging process. So babies, children, basically younger brains are typically more plastic than older brains, but older brains are still constantly changing with new experience. So it's not really like there's a cutoff where you're like, all right, throw in the towel, you can't learn anything new, you're too old. A lot of things like learning new languages apply to this for a lot of people. Like if you expose a child to language, they're going to be picking it up much faster than someone who's a fully fledged adult, but they can still achieve that.
Is that a difference in cognitive ability, or is it just that we're, as an adult human, are a lot more distracted and doing other things, so we're not giving it the time and attention it would need to be able to learn the language in a short amount of time?
I think it may be a combination of the two, but the main thing would be the maturity of the brain as an organ. And this speaks largely to one of our unique attributes as a human, which is our brains are not even developed when we're born. I think we're unique among animals in that capacity, where an infant human child cannot fend for itself. It physically will not survive in the wild. We have another basically year to 2 years before the brain is even ready to go and the child is able to move around on its own. So we have cognitive development not just in the womb, but also after birth, before we're even close to getting ready to go. A lot of animals, you just They're just born into the world. They have to figure out how to stand up, and you're going. Whereas we are a lot slower to ramp up, and usually you describe a fully developed brain as being around 20 years old, give or take. And that's also kind of linked with a few different things that we're trying to understand on a more widespread capacity. So the fun example that people joke about a lot is like this weed legalization process, and how cannabis is something that has been around for a long time, but it's not fully understood with how it affects the mind. But they have measured a few long-term negative side effects if you're using it heavily before your brain is fully matured, which is around the 20-year mark or so for most people. So that raises some questions about, all right, well, what is the brain doing from your mid-teens to your 20s? Because there are a lot of animals in the wild that wouldn't even live to be 15 years. Like a lot of animals, that's just their lifespan. So for us to not even be cognitively fully matured until 20 is pretty amazing in and of itself. And there's a lot to be learned about that process of development. A lot of people in the chat are saying 25. I mean, you could pick a year. It does vary based on person to person to some extent. Maybe 25 is closer to it.
Yeah, I would have had said 25 as well. I think it's different for some people, and I think it gets later and later as we kind of evolve as a species. Where, say, back in the 1900s, it was more necessary for you to kind of be fully developed, not necessarily from a brain point of view, but from how you interact with the outside world, which is kind of how we're, for the most part, judging how old you have to be fully functioning. So I think it doesn't necessarily have an effect on how fast the brain is developing, but also on how fast you as a person need to be standing on your own 2 feet and going out into the workforce or going to war, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it raises a lot of different existential questions about readiness and awareness as an adult. Like, what does it mean to be an adult? How much knowledge should you be able to obtain to be a functional member of society? This and that. And then one of the other aspects here too is scarcity. As resources are more abundant, you have less of a need for people to dive into the workforce early. That's part of this shift of people needed to figure out how to be an adult when they were 14 or 15 a long time ago, and then now 25 to 30 oftentimes is when people are getting into the workforce. And that shift is basically less urgency because we have more food, more abundance of material resource and things like that. And then if you want to theory craft fast forwarding in the future a little bit, as we have more and more automation, as robots are taking our jobs and so forth, and we have to work less, what do we do with our time? How do we find a work-life balance? What is our purpose? Because a lot of human purpose, historically speaking, has been in the work that you do. So doing less work isn't a universal positive. It also kind of creates a void that we have to kind of figure out what is a fulfilling way to spend time that is leisure that we didn't have historically speaking.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is a good point to kind of start getting into Socrates, because he famously had too much time to think about this kind of stuff. And they took a lot of time to kind of figure out what it is to live a good life. This was the basic motivation to do philosophy back then, to kind of make guidelines on what it means to be good, what it means to have a fulfilled life, to be happy, whether or not happiness should be more important than getting rich or famous, for example. What it means to be happy. These are the kind of questions that they were raising. And Socrates was not the first that raised those questions. Since we call everyone that came before him the pre-Socratics, I think it's fair to start with him. And he lived up to 400 before Christ in Athens. This was the golden age of Athenian democracy. He was part of the upper class. He wasn't super rich, but he was part of the rather small group of people that was actually able to participate in democracy, which is they had so many slaves that it's just about maybe 20% of all the population was in that upper class to be able to vote, and another 50% of that were women, which were not allowed to vote. So we're down to 10, probably even less percent of the population that had it good enough to be spending their leisure time doing philosophy and trying to figure out what they should do with their time, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And Socrates lived basically by two virtues that were probably not new, but he's the only person we know about that went through with this and was successful, to some degree at least. And those two virtues were never submit and never have faith.
So you said never submit and never have faith?
Yeah.
Okay.
So basically submitting in the sense of having to work for someone else. Being a slave was thought of as a bad thing, which is probably a nice thing to do when you're not a slave yourself. He didn't put this into action in terms of freeing the slave, but he always talked about how important freedom is as an individual, and to have the time to be thinking or to follow a life that was worth living, which for him was mostly about acquiring wisdom. Mm. So basically his ideal was, he said that there's only one good thing, which is knowledge, and there's only one bad thing, which is ignorance. And the interesting thing here is Confucius, around the same time, in a completely different... He lived in China, so they had no means to communicate, basically. And he came up with some very similar ideas, but he put the emphasis not on the knowledge, but on practicing the knowledge. So basically, knowledge is only as good as you're putting it into practice. So all of Confucian thought was, well, it's okay if you know things, but as long as you're not putting it into practice, it's kind of worth nothing.
Yeah, so we're talking about theoretical knowledge versus applied knowledge.
Exactly. And Socrates believed that no one, or to the point of knowledge, he believed that no one that has knowledge would willingly and knowingly do a bad thing, which is a dubious claim. I think it definitely has its merit. So that we do a lot of quote-unquote bad things out of ignorance, but I don't think it's universally applicable.
Yeah, I think some of it would be knowledge of the suffering of others. Say you're doing something that's selfish, that gains something for you, but takes something away from someone else. A lot of times that's done with the ignorance of the suffering of the other, either in the immediate term or the long term.
Yeah. I think the best idea that I've come up about how we act would be purpose rationality, where we're acting rational to the kind of purpose we set ourselves. So it's, for example, stealing food because you don't have anything you might be rational enough to know that it's not a good thing, but since it's the right thing for you to do because you're hungry, it's basically justified.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so basically never submit, never have faith. And never have faith part is we're kind of fuzzy on what his beliefs were in terms of the realm of the gods in the ancient times. I think he didn't speak out against faith, which would have been, or not to the degree where it was considered too bad. Up to a certain point, we'll get to a bit later on. But for him, having faith means that when you were in an argument and you start to trust the other person with what they're saying, you're always basically you don't know what the other person's motivations are to say something. You have to justify them with your own thinking. So having faith in anything means you're trusting it blindly, which was dubious to him. And a good point that kind of illustrates that was Socrates was opposed to writing. So nothing we know about him was written down by himself. We had other contemporaries of him being Plato and Xenophon for the most part that wrote down what Socrates was saying and how he was thinking. But he himself was opposed to writing because he felt like, well, a piece of paper is dubious because you can't ask it any questions. You're not able to inquire whether or not whomever wrote this down was faithful, whether he was just making a joke, or you don't know the intention behind it. So if you have something written down, you can't question it anymore, which makes it hard to believe in it.
Mm.
So these were his basic beliefs, and he really lived his life up to those, where he constantly went around asking people stuff, inquiring how they were seeing what they thought of this or that, and always challenging them to a point where it was fun to him, I'd say, to question their logic to the point of them not knowing anymore how to respond. So he made a lot of enemies over the time, which ended up in him at some point getting arrested. And they had basically a vote on what should happen to him. And he argued in front of court, basically saying, well, they didn't know any better, and he understands that they were misguided by the poison of what other people were telling them, and that he was just trying to do his best, and he was doing it for the right reasons. So they passed a vote that he was guilty of poisoning the youth of Athens, basically with ideas that were not necessarily good for the state, and also not being faithful to the gods. So those were his charges, and he was found guilty by a bit more than half of the people that voted on it. And since he was found guilty, he had to plead for the sentencing, or what he wanted them to do now that he was found guilty. So he again stepped in front of the court and said, well, I think for the crimes I committed, I want to have a temple built to myself and get a rent for the rest of my life, and maybe build a statue too.
That sounds nice.
Yeah. So when they voted on whether or not he was guilty, it was a really close vote, and the vote on putting him to death was passed by majority. So basically they decided, They were not sure whether or not he was guilty, but once he was found guilty, they were pretty sure that he should be put to death because he just pissed them off a lot during those conversations.
Mm.
And he said, well, it's your fault. If that what you see as the right punishment, I'll accept this. So he was put into prison, which was at the edge of Athens, basically. So he would have been able to leave at any point, just leaving Athens and not being a citizen anymore, basically. He would have had a lot of wealthy friends on the countryside he would have stayed with, but he decided that this was, if they found that this was the right thing to do, then he's okay with that. So he really lived up to his principles to never submit and pleading he was innocent or trying to make a deal of any kind. He was just, all right, if they want to put me to death, let's go for it.
So one of the things that jumps out at me with his path and in this capacity is, as a career philosopher, he's going around asking people a lot of questions about their beliefs, which, if my experience is any indication, a lot of times if people are questioned thoroughly enough, they run into areas where they realize their own ignorance and their own indecision and sometimes their own contradiction, and that is deeply upsetting because our beliefs and our perspectives and stuff are oftentimes some of the most sacred aspects of our lives. And if some wanderer comes up and challenges the core of how we identify to live in the world, that's annoying, obnoxious, upsetting if you're not kind of prepared to embrace that process. So yeah, I can see how he would upset a lot of people because he's shaking up the status quo with his questioning and his challenging of a lot of people's assumptions. It is a very uncomfortable feeling to have a conversation with someone and then be put into a position where it's quite clear that you're on weaker ground than you thought you were, because that oftentimes creates a line of questioning you can take on your own after the conversation to kind of see, well, what do I do now? If I was wrong about this and it's become clear to me, how do I fill in this gap? Can I fill in this gap? And how do I move forward as a person? So yeah, he's kind of an agent of chaos in that capacity, where by people having conversations with him, some people may feel like they've gained a new perspective. They may feel inspired to seek knowledge because they've been shown ignorance. Other people would get defensive and they would say, why are you challenging these traditions that we perceive to be good?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, one important thing I kind of forgot to mention, which is not necessarily important, but I think it's a fun thing to know about him, is basically in Athens, they had some weird notions of nobility. Nobility was closely tied to beauty. So if you're beautiful, you're therefore noble, you're therefore wise. They kind of had these concepts that all tied into each other. And Socrates himself was pretty ugly. And they made fun of him, he made fun of himself for being ugly. And he was not someone you would normally perceive to be of nobility, just because he was walking around in dirty rags. He was talking to everyone, which wasn't normal for an aristocrat at the time. And he was just, basically, he was always this weird figure that everyone knew in Athens, and a lot of people respected for his thoughts and for his ideas, but also a lot of people despised because he was just basically too weird to be part of their society. And yeah, what do we know Socrates days? I think one of the biggest quotes, the best known quote is, "The only true wisdom is knowing you know nothing."
Being aware of your own ignorance, yep.
Exactly. So, but basically, going back to never have faith, not even have faith in your own knowledge, or just keep questioning, and you'll probably never end questioning or get to a point where you're really satisfied with the answer. But the answer is not as important as the process of just gaining more knowledge, because knowledge was also tied to beauty. It was a concept that was he thought of as um, it makes you more noble as you get more knowledge. And then there's another really funny quote I found, since I am married. So he said that by all means marry. If you get a good wife, you'll become happy. If you get a bad wife, you'll become a philosopher. Not 100% sure how that applies to me. It's, it's a really nice quote. Also, one of the really big things he came up with, and I tried to really look this up, and it's based on the sources, it's really fuzzy whether this was him or not. But the golden rule that you should treat others in the way you wanted, treat others in the manner in which one would want to be treated by them. Mm-hmm. So that you should act towards others as you want them to act towards you. And in contrast to this was Confucius, which came up with the silver rule. And again, it goes back and forth who did what. And he said that it shouldn't be the positive version where you basically should do to others what you want them to do to you, but it should be the negation that you shouldn't treat others the way you do not want them to treat you, which is a lot easier to follow.
Yeah. I hadn't heard of that, but that makes sense as a companion rule.
Yeah, so he believed in knowledge as the greatest good and the greatest, the best thing you could aspire towards. And having knowledge was a way to control your own mind, your own body, and your own heart. And constantly staying away from the one evil, which is ignorance. Basically, by never submitting, never having faith, always questioning yourself. He lived his life up to the point of getting put to death, which took quite a while, and he ended up drinking poisoned hammock to end his own life, and had this beautiful argument about this being okay for him. And he had a lot of friends over, kind of trying to convince him to leave or to convince him to get another court appeal. And he said, well, I'm going to do that if you can argue with me that doing that would be the better decision than not doing it. And since he won all those arguments, he finally took his own life on behalf of the Athenian state. Yeah, so that's the short of the life of Socrates.
One of the things that I don't think I heard you mention is I don't know if this is correct, the concept of Socratic ignorance, which is the more you know, the more you realize your own ignorance, and how that applies to a lot of, basically any field where you're acquiring knowledge. If you study for a little bit, oftentimes you feel like you have a decent grasp, but if you keep going, you realize how big the problem is, and you realize the depth and the breadth of your ignorance. And I think that it kind of relates to his quest as a person, where he was constantly seeking knowledge, but also constantly recognizing areas where we're ignorant. So it's not really like he expected to discover truth. He wanted to understand the landscape of knowledge and ignorance.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Also, looking at my notes, I forgot to mention that he really felt about knowledge as not just a pursuit. He felt this almost erotic love for knowledge, which might be weird connotation nowadays. And he said that knowledge doesn't come from reason alone, but it's a combination between reason and divine inspiration, which they're kind of fuzzy on what the divine inspiration actually means. So basically, he thought that our brain is only able to reason as in so far as we need to have some outside force giving us this inspiration to do good thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the divine, I think, raises the question of, well, does that count as faith? And my immediate thought was he may have had a pantheist perspective, where, for those who don't know, it's thinking about the divine as all that is, rather than as a particular agent. So like a god, for example, that's more theological, where there's an entity with its own will, versus pantheism is kind of like everything together is the divine of existence, which may have been his perspective there. So you can still use that terminology without necessarily invoking Zeus, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, and since he didn't write things down himself, it's kind of hard to pinpoint him on what he meant by that. But I think that's a good description of it being more of a belief in faith or in something bigger rather than Zeus putting words into your mouth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so he was basically the first archetype of a somewhere between hero and hero, where it wasn't about this struggle for not getting subjugated, but it wasn't a quest for power, which is unique in literature up until his point. Which isn't to say that there were not other people that were doing that, but it's like the first mention in history that we know of someone that was just basically trying to live life in a pursuit of knowledge rather than in a pursuit of power or in any other kind of pursuit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because basically the pursuit of power would be seeking material wealth, seeking control over other people, military might, political power, that kind of thing. Whereas he's just seeking understanding, which is more of a process of introspection and conversation, which doesn't really net him riches or soldiers or a lot of those different aspects that we would consider to be the pursuit of power.
Exactly. And yeah, so Socrates was this important because one of his students was Plato. And this is where we start to get people that write their own stuff down, which is amazing from a lot of perspectives, since I think this is where we start to get a glimpse into how consciousness works in other people, because we're having them writing down their thoughts and how they argued. So we're starting to get a sense of how they were thinking back at the time. And whenever we talk about philosophers, it's important to kind of put them into context of their time and what they were believing and what informed their worldview, basically. So when we start talking about Plato, we need to go a bit more in depth on what we know about his beliefs, which were quite funny for in some areas. And yeah, I think we kind of maybe want to round out Socrates first, if there's any questions from chat or anything else you want to touch on there.
Well, I think that was a pretty good encapsulation. One thing that I've heard is that he's a bit more of a legendary figure than a lot of the more modern philosophers because of where it was in history and because he didn't write things down himself. So a lot of times you link certain concepts with this person, or his mythos kind of grows a little bit more than maybe he was as an actual person. So you want to kind of be aware of that. Like, the further you get in history, the more often you kind of romanticize certain figures. An example from my more recent reading is the history of the Viking era. There was a TV show that was made, it's a historical fiction called Vikings, and the core figure they start with is Ragnar Lothbrok, who was a legendary Viking who supposedly raided England and all this and had a bunch of different campaigns, but his character in actual literature is kind of legendary. He may have been the combination of a few different characters. A lot of his reported sons were historical and real, and you know where they were buried and this and that, but that's part of the problem with this quest to understand philosophy, is the further back you go, the less evidence you have. And Socrates, with you starting with him, I would guess this is the first one where we feel like we have enough historical evidence and enough actual report of what he said to build off of it as a foundation of Western thought.
Well, kind of. There were a bunch of people before him that had different ideas that he worked with and that influenced his thinking as well. But it's basically, since he was this shining figure in Greek history, and his two students, or rather Plato, his direct student, and Socrates, being a student of Plato, had so much influence and were, for the most part, directly influenced by Socrates. That's where it's kind of, he's the starting point, because he started this whole movement that kind of is Western philosophy, basically. But they already had some interesting ideas back then, before Socrates came around. So one of the things they noticed was, for example, that at some point all the land masses were under sea, because they found evidence of fish scales that turned to stone on top of every mountain. So it was reasonable to believe that at some point everything had to be underwater. They also started with this basic principle of everything is made out of elements, which is to say atoms, which was not Socrates. I think that was Aristotle that kind of coined the term. But basically, they already had a lot of ideas going by the time Socrates came around, but he was this shining figure that kind of started this notion of, all right, we're doing philosophy now. We're just talking about stuff and questioning everything and see where that gets us. Mm-hmm. While most of the pre-Socratics were within a specific field, doing studies on geometry, for example, the Pythagoreans, or trying to figure out whether or not we evolved from fish was a concept they had back then. So they influenced quite a lot on our thinking today. I think Socrates is the starting point. It's where it all gets a lot denser.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the contrast there is people who had other careers and thought about philosophy kind of on the side, versus that was his whole life. That was his career. So kind of creating the career philosopher archetype by his example.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to bring up another example of the romanticizing of history. The same thing is happening to samurai culture, which was probably a pretty bloody time, and it was mostly about collecting heads of your enemy to of your enemies to get the reward for how many people you killed. And a friend of mine sent me this beautiful concept they had in Japanese called Futsu. And its definition is killing a passerby in order to test a new sword.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just this normalization of basically killing someone to see whether or not your katana was sharp enough. And we're doing a lot of romanticizing in terms of the samurai codex and how they behave, when reality probably was a lot different.
There's another thing to mention with that, though, is oftentimes the brutality will also be overestimated. One thing about human life and existence is, I believe a lot of it is fairly banal. It's fairly boring. There's not too much going on. You could say that a given samurai likely spent more time sitting around than actually killing people. So sometimes these extreme examples of violence also come up a little bit more louder than they should. Basically, these are career fighters. Some of them are more disciplined and principled than others. Some of them maybe appear very noble, and people like Musashi Miyamoto write a whole bunch. He's kind of a philosopher in his own right and an artist. And then many who would call themselves samurai were effectively bandits who are just bullying others, stealing things, doing that kind of stuff. So it's the full spectrum. So you're right. Things can get romanticized. They were likely more brutal than we thought in certain capacities, but I would also add that sometimes we play it up too much. There's an example in Viking history where there's this execution method called the Blood Eagle that was likely made up, where you're supposed to be doing something really nasty, pulling someone's lungs out from their back. It was kind of played up and then used in literature, but in the practical capacity really probably wasn't applied very much at all. So it goes both ways, where sometimes you romanticize things as being better than they were, like samurai could stop a bullet with their sword, yeah, right, versus more brutal than they actually were, where you focus on the extremes of a demographic rather than the average or the norm or the range.
Yeah, I think that's a good view on it. That it's the whole range, and we tend to pick out the facts that are most interesting to us, basically, whether that be the more violent part or the romanticizing of it.
Yeah.
And I think it's fair to assume that there was a bunch of romanticizing around the figure that Socrates was. As we get into Plato and him arguing for the philosopher king, I think we can fairly assume that whenever he was advertising for a philosopher king, he was thinking of Socrates doing that, even though he was already dead at the time, which was one of the main reasons that Plato had such a low opinion of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but so as we get into Plato and his student Aristotle, we're starting to talk about the two main schools of thought about how we can gain knowledge, basically, which would be rationalism and empiricism. So Plato thought that all knowledge comes from basically arguing with yourself, finding rational arguments to support your claims. And he did that for a bunch of different core concepts within Greek culture, trying to figure out what it means to have friends, for example, or how to do education right, or famously how to make a good state. So he was just constantly arguing with people about whether or not it it's right to have a state where a good example would be he was the first one to advocate for women voting. And the way he did that was basically go up to the group of people that were listening to him and say, all right, let's ponder this. Just give me some time, I'll walk you through it. Let's just say we let women participate in gymnastics. And they all went, well, gymnastics, it's what we do, and we kind of don't want the women around. Important at the time that they were doing gymnastics naked, and it was this thing that all the aristocrats participated in. They constantly did some kind of who was the fastest 80-year-old, or who was the one that can throw a stone the furthest. So they had this constant need to participate in some kind of contest, but it wasn't as much about winning. I mean, it was good to win, but it was just knowing what you're good at and showing off what you can do with it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, he started this argument where he basically pointed out that if we're not letting women participate in gymnastics, we're losing half of all good the good people that could participate. So they argued against it, that it would be weird since they would be naked too, and that would arouse sexual feelings. So Plato argued that, well, that might be the case, but that's basically the person's problem. It's not that we should, just because someone has a problem with it, we should stop women from participating. And he walks them through this argument, and they tend to agree because he really made good points. And he keeps going up until the point where he's just like, well, and if we let them participate in gymnastics, if we let them participate here and there, they might as well participate in politics or become king. And they were like, well, all right, maybe. And something he kind of did was tire out his audience, where they just, at some point, you don't want to disagree anymore because it would just start more conversation, and you're kind of tired of it already. So they finally agreed with him that women should be able to participate in government, which is a concept that will not show up again for at least another 1,500 years. Yeah, but so that's basically what Socrates did. He talked about these ideas that were important to him and how to implement them into society. And as I said before, he had some rather weird beliefs about the nature of the soul. So back in ancient Athens, you had this concept of transmigration of the soul, which means that the soul is something that's not dying, that can just pass on from one person to another. They also had no sexes, so it's this undying it that can just go on. And related to that, they had this concept of anamnesia. And anamnesia was, since you have this soul that's been around for a lot longer than you have, the soul knows everything, or knows a lot of things at least. And every time you learn something new, it's not you learning something new, but it's your soul remembering what it already knew, which is a neat concept to have this kind of the good feeling you get from the feeling you have that, well, I kind of knew this already, but this is a way better way of putting it.
So it's a process of rediscovery, you could say.
Exactly. And so this is where we kind of need to talk about his idea of the perfect what's the term? Perfect ideas. So he pondered the question whether something conjured up with our mind is something that exists. So basically, if you think about a chair, you probably have a specific chair in mind, but it's not like, no matter where you go, which chair you look at, you'll always be remembered of this concept of a chair, which doesn't necessarily apply to any specific chair, but it's just a chair that is the perfect form of chair, which is not to say that it's necessarily good to sit on. It's this abstract concept of a chair that's applied everywhere, and no matter how you call it, how you think of it, you'll always be thinking of a chair.
The perfect idea of a chair, but not necessarily the most perfectly comfortable chair.
Exactly. So this was his concept, that we're approaching this perfect form when we think about stuff. So we'll always be, everything we can conjure up in our mind is a representation or is guiding us towards the perfect form, which is somewhere out there. Which is a weird concept, but it kind of makes sense, as in there's things we cannot necessarily talk about, like infinity would be a good example, where it's just this abstract idea of something that never ends, that we cannot, there's no way for the human mind to comprehend infinity to its full extent. But we have this neat concept of infinity that is just something that never ends. So we can think of it in the abstract, but not like we can't think of something that would be infinite. And this was basically his idea of a perfect, that there are things out there that are not necessarily approachable by our minds, but they're still there as abstractions of reality, basically.
And infinity is a fun thing you get to mess with in mathematics. I think around the 4th year of calculus is when we would actually be working with stuff. This was in a course that was called Fundamental Theorems of Calculus, also known as analysis. But yeah, it's tricky business. You can play with the concept, but you don't ever really dive into the concept of infinity and really get to a satisfying answer. It's one of those things that we use it more in the practical sense rather than the actual sense.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different perfect forms out there. Everything exists in this world of perfect forms, but we're never really able to reach it. But as we get better, or our soul gets better at remembering things, being anamnesia, we get closer to these ideal version of things. So basically, by gaining knowledge, you again get away from ignorance by remembering what your soul already knew. And this for him was again how to improve as a person. And this is also something that Socrates already talked about, but Plato kind of fleshed out on how we improve as a person, which was one of his main concepts besides his talk of the state. And even his works on the state, not necessarily to have a good state, but to have a good person within the state. So he was really focused on the individual and how to get better as an individual. So his basic concept was that we're this rather wild animal that can improve by gaining knowledge, by every kind of input that we're getting, be it education, be it friendship, be it beauty as a big concept there, that you gain wisdom, or you gain you improve through seeing beauty, which is something that we don't really have anymore as a concept. We're missing out a bit.
Chat saying stoicism.
Yeah, Plato was a big influence on. We'd be chumping a bunch of people if we get into Stoicism right now.
Yeah, we're kind of setting the groundwork here, which it's gonna make people think of what it leads into. Yeah, it's an interesting concept of the aspect of, like you're saying, being a wild animal that can gain knowledge and in the process train itself. If you think about humans, we are equipped to be wild animals, but we don't really live that way anymore. And a lot of being as he's saying, a good citizen of society involves understanding what society you're living in and what your duties, responsibilities are as a person moving in that system. And also to his awareness of Socrates and his fate, it's also identifying the flaws in it and having a critical approach to democracy, whatever different government that you're operating under, and how you can challenge that and improve that by working on the building block of who you are.
Yeah. Yeah, so the concept that human is an animal that needs to be tamed is both in Plato and in Aristotle. And in contrast to that, and Confucius thought, they thought of humans being innately good, and which isn't to say that we can improve. Again, they having the emphasis a lot more on practical improvement than just improving through knowledge. But the example that was brought up by Mencius, who was I think 2 generations after Confucius, he said if you see a child playing on the side of a well and it falls into it, almost no one would think of what negative consequences it could have if you jumped after it and tried to save it. Almost everyone would just go and try to do the best they can to save the kid. So this was basically his argument for humans being good by nature, that we want to help if we see there is need. There's someone in need that needs help from us.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it gets more difficult if it gets more abstract. So if it's something that's happening right in front of you, you're likely to help than when you hear that they're doing bad in Africa and they need your money to save them. I think it's a different kind of abstraction we're having nowadays to the whole approach of helping someone else. But his argument was that if there's someone in immediate need of help, we're good people and we will try to help no matter what.
Yeah, there are some interesting phenomena they've noticed as well, where if you're alone and there's someone who needs assistance, you're more likely to take action than if there's a crowd of people and a crisis unfolds, because a lot of times the crowd will hesitate because they'll think, well, someone else is going to solve this problem, as opposed to if you're isolated with the person in need of assistance, there's a greater chance you're gonna go for that. So we do have not just individual psychological tendencies, but we also have aspects of how we behave differently if we're in a group as opposed to on our own.
Now, it kind of makes sense that we're a bit more hesitant, or we feel like, well, there's probably someone that knows better how to help, but if it ends up that no one helps because everyone thinks, well, definitely someone better to do it, we're definitely creating a problem.
Yep.
So maybe if you ever get into a situation, this would be the problem where there's too many people and everyone thinks someone else should do it. This is basically what we learn here when it comes to helping people in emergency situations. Basically, if you have a car crash happening, so you need someone to kind of take the lead and give out different responsibilities to people. And this doesn't necessarily need to be the one who's most knowledgeable in it, but just the one that kind of goes, all right, you're going to call an ambulance, we're going to check over there, and just the one that's most ready to take action, not necessarily the one best suited for it.
Yeah, it's initiative, leadership, speaking ability, stuff like being able to speak clearly and loudly so that everyone can hear what's going on, things like that. Those are interesting aspects of speechcraft that I think aren't quite emphasized enough in our education process. This is a little bit off topic, but a lot of these life skills of how to be a good citizen, as Plato is talking about, aren't really a part of our modern education. But it seems like historically different philosophers and thinkers have kind of arrived upon these issues and been able to articulate why they're important.
And I think that this is kind of the whole pursuit of most of kind of figure out how to make the best out of the human condition, especially when we go into ethics or how to live a good life. It's not necessarily how to best apply rules to others, but how to figure out for yourself what you could do with your life and that affects you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a lot to be gained personally from reading, not just basically if you read the Art of War, which is at least to some degree is philosophy as well. It's not necessarily focused on how you as a person can get better, but rather how you as a general win a war. And it's definitely doing a good job in that sense, but it doesn't apply to you as a person as much, unless you really want to become a famous general, basically.
Mm-hmm.
How are we doing on time?
We're, I think, around an hour 35 or so, hour 40 in. So depending on where we want to round this off, you said Socrates, Plato, Aristotle is the other we're going to hit?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Would it be okay for me to take a short break and then I'll come back and we can get into Socrates?
Aristotle?
Aristotle. Yeah. Sorry.
Cool. Sounds good. Take your time.
All right.
Yo. So what's up, chat? Yes, I am reading it. He's not reading during this time. This is a friend and regular of the stream, EcceFatum. He hangs out pretty often. He pretty much always asks a question for Agent Smith on Sundays. and he has studied philosophy for a long time. So I reached out to him and asked him if we could have a discussion on philosophy. And since the average viewer here, myself included, isn't super learned in philosophy, I think it's nice to have a comprehensive approach to the problem, starting with the beginning. So this is the early history of philosophy of mind, starting with the Greek thinkers. So it's Western philosophy is what we're focusing on here. But yeah, for a lot of it, it's really tough to like immediately translate everything into your modern philosophical experience. It is more of the big picture that we're working at right now to get some context for how we're trying to discuss a lot of these problems. If it seems like a lot of information and it's complicated, that's because it is. But this is fun. I think this is fun. I've been enjoying this so far. I'll be right back. All right. Yeah, I did.
Hello.
Yo, what's up? So
What were you about to say?
We're back. I did see multiple questions about the Bible. So I know Christianity has had a big impact on Western culture. This isn't the topic for this discussion, but it's something that a lot of people bring up as the basis for a lot of their personal understanding of principles, morality, ethics, this kind of thing. And I was raised Christian, so I definitely understand that perspective and where it comes from, because for a lot of people in the Western world, they will have learned a lot more about virtue and truth and principles and values from those biblical teachings rather than from what we're talking about here, which is the Greek philosophers back in the day. So this is focused on that. Yes, you may have your reference for that. We could talk about that at some point, but any given angle at morality, any sufficiently large body of literature is going to take a really long time to unpack. So for efficiency's sake, we've narrowed it down for this one for Plato, Aristotle, Socrates.
Yeah, but they're not as unrelated as it would seem, since the first version of the New Testament was originally in Greek, and not the most poetic, beautiful Greek, to be honest. It was rather archaic for the time.
Mm-hmm.
This is where translated into Latin and made was fleshed out a lot, and basically they changed a bunch of stuff within it for the Latin version, and then it was translated to a bunch of other languages. I think the King James version is the most common in English.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there is an interesting. The Bible as we know it came to be time. It's interesting to know that it was first, like the oldest version of it we know is a Greek version,
Mm-hmm.
which is not surprising since most of the best works of that time were in Greek. So this is a interesting fact about Greek culture. The Greeks have been overrun by a bunch of different cultures, armies, however you want to call that. And basically what happened was that everyone that came into Greece, when they left, they spoke Greek, because it was a superior language to speak about any number of concepts. So it was adapted by the people that came from the outside, and they brought it back to where they came from. So Greek culture was dominant, not in military sense, although they did that too, but really the culture themselves was so strong because the language was so strong that they influenced everything, and a lot of thinkers that came later on did their works in Greek because it was such a beautiful language.
Mm-hmm.
And another interesting point here is whenever the Romans had problems within their political system, but you were not allowed to criticize it directly, they wrote these works about what was happening in Greece and how they had the same problem and how they applied solutions to it. So they were always masking their criticism by writing about Greek history, basically, which is something we could learn from nowadays. Piss off people when you talk about politics, so you just frame it, well, they had this problem in ancient Greece. This is how they solved it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Plato basically thought everything comes from rational thought. You need to know how to think good in order to be a good thinker. Going into notions of logic, which we'll be talking a bit more about when we talk about Aristotle, who fleshed out the whole theory of logic, amongst many other things. So while all of Plato's beliefs are based in his own rationality and how he approached these issues, and as we see with the notion of the transmigration of the soul and anamnesia, that he was strongly influenced by his preconceived notions of what the soul was and how all these kind of things worked. And in contrast to that was Aristotle, who believed that rationality is all well and good, but as long as we don't have any physical evidence for it, it's just not good thinking. And he started a bunch of different inquiries into physics, biology, zoology, ethics, poetry, rhetoric, psychology, linguistics, economics, and politics, and always tried to do it scientifically. And this was something that was known before, but it was never fleshed as he did it. And he's basically the founder of all the empirical notions of how we're doing science nowadays is kind of built upon his works, which is quite a feat for a single person. Yeah, it kind of relates to how thinking as philosophy as something on its own, when back then philosophy was just basically thinking. So for him, writing about physics, writing about psychology or biology, this was all just philosophy for him, where he just applies his knowledge to look for truth in the world, through his senses, also through mathematical proofs, as the Pythagoreans did. And this was the quest of his life, was basically to denounce all of Aristotle's rationality in favor for applied knowledge that was verifiable.
Wait, Aristotle denounced Plato, or vice versa?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so you can't just trust pure reason, you have to measure and to prove as well.
Exactly. Yeah, so he was a student of Plato, and there's a lot of Plato's teaching that goes into Aristotle as well. When it comes to pure rationality, he started to, all right, let's see if this is something that we can observe in the world outside. So one of the things he did was basically make this model of Earth that was based on 5 elements. So there was earth and water, air, fire, and everything. Basically the perfect circle going things around us, being stars, they were within the ether. And then he did some work on what we know as gravity now. So basically he said that Earth obviously has to be the heaviest, so it's the ground layer, and on top of that is obviously water, since it's less dense than Earth, but more dense than the air that surrounds it, and fire being a layer outside of the air. So when we drive out with a spaceship, we would go through a layer of fire before we get to the ether. So this was kind of his worldview, and he found a lot of good evidence for that. So basically you had volcanoes where the fire is trying to reach back up to the heavenly layer it's in, or you have a tree, which is this combination of earth and water. So it's growing above the regular earth, since there's water in it too. Mm-hmm. So this was one of his approaches to determine how the order of the world, the order of things to be, which is not 100% correct, as we know nowadays, but it was this it was a good theory to start on, to kind of have something.
Well, the modern tool we have is the periodic table of elements, and this was basically the predecessor to that, where it wasn't correct, but it was the first attempt at organizing the physical world and how the different layers were different from each other. There's so much different, like, media and art and stuff like that that calls upon those. So those are still very much a part of modern thought. An example would be like Avatar series, earth, air, fire, and water are the different elements that you can bend and stuff. And we still talk about them like elements.
Yeah. Yeah, we're still very much rooted in Aristotle's way of thinking of things to some degree, but then there's also where we kind of were able to go a bit further and know more than he did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so is there any specific field to get into in terms of his thoughts? Because they're basically everything he did was kind of true, but also is not necessarily the modern knowledge of things. So he had a bunch of different views on the soul or motion and optics, which all basically inform to some degree on how we see the modern world. I think a good example would be his works on biology and trying to make a system how different kinds of animals are organized.
Taxonomy.
Yeah. So in his taxonomy, he was looking whether or not something had 2 legs or 4 legs, whether or not something had feathers or didn't have feathers, and if it had a fur or scales. Just he made this really basic taxonomy that we're still using to some degree. I think we got a little bit more in depth. But it also, and this was based on some of Plato's work, where he called man the featherless bird.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, what was the guy called? I don't remember the name, but basically he plucked all the feathers from a chicken and went to Plato's academy and said, "Behold, Plato's man."
Mm-hmm.
So just to show that, well, only because you're bipedal and don't have any feathers, you're not necessarily human.
Yeah.
So they were a really fun bunch back in the day to kind of challenge each other with their beliefs. How to think.
Diogenes? Is that the person?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Thanks, Chad.
Yeah, he was called Diogenes the Cynic.
So he did taxonomy. It seems like Aristotle was more of a polymath than Plato and Socrates, who were more purists where it came to philosophy first, whereas he's tackling biology. The soul is kind of that spiritual understanding, and it's interesting the different ways that people have approached spirituality. It's describing the essence of our human spirit and what that is. Can you measure that? Where is it? What is it? Because you have the transcendent spiritual essence that some people describe, where it's immaterial, it's not physical, it goes beyond your physical body and it never goes away. Those different elements. And then you have a purely naturalistic perspective, which is the soul is a part of the body, and when the body dies, the soul ends as well. What was Aristotle's perspective on this?
So when you go back to our normal view on the different states of consciousness, we kind of can look at it in that context. So basically, he made 3 distinctions. Basically, he said that both plants, animals, and humans have souls, but to different degrees. So a plant has a vegetative soul, which is concerned about reproduction and growth. An animal has a sensitive soul, which is able to feel sensation and basically it does the same thing as the plants, but animals have sensation on top of that, and so humans have sensation, growth, reproduction, and rationality, or the possibility to think and reflect. So these were the three different kind of souls that he talked about. Mm-hmm. And I think if we're looking at the study, it's somewhat reflected in there that we're thinking, like for example, the vegetative state where you're wakeful but not conscious. So it's somewhat similar.
Yeah, it makes me think of perhaps that's the origin of why we describe it that way. Because the plant is fully alive and it's making progress in the living capacity, but it's also not aware in the ways that we would describe an animal to be aware of its surroundings, to dream and so forth, to process. Yeah, there's whenever you take a history of cognitive science course, usually Descartes is one of the first ones, and a lot of what you've been saying about the different types of spirit of Aristotle, I think, were a part of what informed Descartes, where he described different animal spirits within the body that kind of transfer around, that other animals would have, sending signals from one place to another that got really close to the truth of how our nervous system works. Wasn't perfect, but it was a model that ended up being really useful for getting close to the right answer. Oops.
Yeah, so we're constantly building up on these ideas and kind of making them more nuanced and getting new science in that kind of confirms what we already thought we believed about the souls or about knowledge. So maybe Plato wasn't as wrong about the anamnesia part, where we're just starting to be a bit less forgetful over time. Mm-hmm. And we already knew we're constantly getting closer to that, these Platonic ideals of how to think about something, or how the consciousness is, basically, without ever being able to reach it.
Yeah. The word that jumps out there in math is asymptote. Like, as you asymptotically approach a given limit, you're closer than ever before, but at the same time it becomes harder and harder to reach the finish line.
Like it gets harder and harder to reach absolute zero.
Yeah.
Where the amount of energy you need gets so high that you're never reach it.
Yeah. So Aristotle moved things really far forward with his elements, with his taxonomy, with his perception of the soul and what that was. What would you say his influences on democracy and society were?
He talked about politics too, but not to the extent of Plato. So I think we're a lot more influenced by Plato in terms of political thinking. Basically, he probably felt like, well, Plato is covering this, so take everything else. But in terms of when we're looking at how we're doing politics nowadays, we're a lot more based in empirical reasoning than we are in rational. So it's a lot more data-based than it is, well, let's just have a conversation about how we do good governance.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not necessarily his thoughts of politics that were influential, but his method that informed a lot about how we do politics nowadays.
And one thing that has also shifted too is the complexity of the world we live in, the number of different moving parts. We've had the Industrial Revolution, we have the internet now, so governance is a comparatively different and more complex problem to solve now than it was historically speaking. Populations are larger than they were before, so like solving the problem of what is good governance for a nation depends a lot on the population, the demographics, the technology, the military, things like that, which gets really complicated really fast.
Yeah, I think the difference in approach is that if you're coming from the rational side of things, you can just argue, well, we ought to all be just good citizens and good humans, and then we have a good society. Where when it's evidence-based, you need to find the right sources that will point towards, all right, this is the way to make a good society. So I think it's a lot easier to come from a rational point of view when you do political philosophy than it is from an empirical point of view. As we talked about in the beginning, as complexity gets more difficult, we build up all these terms and how we think about the world. We have all these data points we can look towards to see whether or not this is working or that is working. Sometimes it would be beneficial to us to just take a step back and go back to Plato's way of thinking and just looking skeptical at why we're doing what we're doing and whether or not this is working, or if we could just think about it in a different way and maybe get a different result out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're really narrowing ourselves down by being tied down to basically we're doing what we've already been doing and it works to some degree, and we're really scared of changing things up because it might not work. Which I think there's good reason to that, to be cautious about changing stuff up. But as long as we're not trying new things, we're never going to get data on how to interpret what we've been doing.
Yeah, there's a quote that applies to this process. Change happens when the pain to remain the same becomes too great. It kind of fits with the element of inertia, where we tend to try to stay moving in the way that we already are, and anything that involves a different process is going to be uncomfortable, and there's resistance to that discomfort.
Yeah, I think it's also something that's where there's only big changes as soon as there's been people hungry or the weather has been bad for a long time. So it needs a lot of bad external factors for social change. And then it's always a question of what philosophy listen to organize anew, or what demagogue or tyrant, as Plato would have put it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that might be another small point we can kind of get into if you're up for it. Basically, Plato's ideas about how we should do governance, because he saw democracy failing because democracy killed Socrates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think part of that likely informed some of American political ideology from the beginning. So the people who we refer to in the US as the founding fathers created not just a popular vote, but an electoral college. Basically, different systems that are intended to balance each other and check each other for power, rather than having just a pure vote for certain things. Because sometimes, like in the example of Socrates, you have the majority vote as being what we would consider to be incorrect or unjust. So just because you have a vote doesn't mean that that's always going to be the correct way forward, especially if certain people are ignorant and they're not voting in good faith or with good information about what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Plato argues what happens if the majority of wolves votes against the minority of sheep on what's for dinner.
Yeah.
And that there is an inherent problematic about how to distribute power to a small minority. And basically his argument was that as long as we're doing good, everything will be fine. As soon as we'll start running into problems, we'll have someone showing up that tells us how to do things and will most likely mislead us in that sense. So democracy gives rise to the demagogue that just promises something and on his own conquest of power, and the demagogue will lead to tyranny. So this was his basic argument why we should be very distrustful of democracy itself. On the other hand, he argued for a system of philosopher kings, which I'm not sure is not doesn't have the same problem with who are we gonna elect to a philosopher king, or how we decide on who that should be. I think it has the same innate problem that we're eventually someone will show up that will argue they can solve our problem, and they will only do so to get to power and do whatever they want to do.
We talked about this in the most recent Agent Smith, which is the issue of career politicians. As they understand how to play the role and work the system, they're going to be more successful than your average citizen who might want to take up a stewardship in the political process in good faith. So the career politician understands how to campaign, how to give votes, how to be charismatic and push people's buttons to fire them up and this kind of thing. So it's a really difficult thing to enact into law, because whatever system you create, there are going to be people who are trying to exploit that system for their own gain rather than to work in it for its intended purpose.
Yeah, I think it's the working in politics has the right incentives to attract the wrong people.
Yeah, there's a lot of power in politics, and people who are after power, generally speaking, are doing it for selfish reasons, which is generally frowned upon, seen as wrong, rather than virtuous.
Yeah, I think if they were about the pursuit of knowledge, they wouldn't necessarily get into politics. And as we've learned, knowledge is not necessarily the only way, but one of the better ways to get towards virtue, since you need to know what you're doing. And this is also a fascinating concept in ethics. Basically, how you behave. Let's say I'll be doing the right thing out of the wrong reasons. So I'll help you because I feel I gain something from it. Would that be ethical? Also, what happens if I help you by mistakes, by trying to do the wrong thing? So there's this whole net of different behaviors, and looking at it from a intention point of view or from an outcome point of view makes it ethical or unethical at the same time. So that's kind of interesting. And I'd say, as it relates to politics, when you have the incentive to get power by getting elected, it doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily important on what you want to do once you're in power, as long as the motivation to get power comes from doing something good. It's basically a good thing. If you want to get power to do something bad, it's a bad thing. But it gets rather tricky on whether or not, another good example is whether or not the means justify the end, or even more interestingly, how whether or not the ends justify the means. Basically, if you're in a system where the ends justify the means, you can do anything as long as the outcome is correct. And in Nietzsche's system, he said, well, it doesn't matter what you're doing it for as long as you're using it to do the right thing. So these are all these different ideas they came up with over time that kind of show you the relativity of how we're, like, most of our thinking is black and white, and we wanted to have it easy when we were thinking of anything. And basically what philosophy's been doing over the course of history was just always challenging this black or white beliefs and showing the areas of gray where it's just not clear whether we're doing the right or the wrong thing, or if it's the right way to think about something or not. So that's the beauty of philosophy, to put some more shades of gray into the world.
Yeah, it's not just what you do, it's how you do it and what you've been intending to do, which is a lot of different things. It makes me think of funny examples of villains who end up accidentally doing something really positive, and it's like, no, I'm actually a terrible person, this was a complete accident, I'm very sorry. Yeah, it's a lot of stuff to untangle. So we've laid a really nice groundwork here, I think, with the three of the big Greeks in the early game. And I like that you mentioned the point about the Greek language being a very powerful instrument for articulating a lot of these concepts, and how that was an edge for their culture and their nation in making a lot of these advances in sciences and philosophy. I think it was Richard Dawkins who talked about language being an instrument that should be used to the full, and oftentimes that means drawing on old ideas but also being able to innovate new approaches, new words, and new ideas, and that kind of thing. So that's something that I didn't really think of with Greece being a leader in philosophy, as language being one of their edges, but it definitely makes sense.
I think this will be interesting when we talk about Confucianism. It's been the longest standing written culture where basically someone that knows how to read Chinese nowadays would still be able more or less to read ancient Chinese, which I'm not sure, have you ever read a a text in Old English.
Yeah, it's effectively a different language.
Yeah. So English with a lot less different letters or different signs as it relates to the Chinese over its running course has had a lot more changes than Chinese has had, which makes it such a rich and interesting written culture where you can go back in time over 2,500 years and see what they were thinking and how they were thinking, what terms they were using, because we still have all the translations, we still have all the commentaries of those translations to really be able to go back and understand what they were saying. Because with all the other languages, it's always, at some point, it gets to be a matter of translation. And a lot of the texts that we have from the old Greeks are not, we don't have in the original Greek anymore. They got gathered by, I'm drawing a blank on what the culture was called, but basically, there was a time when Islamic culture was really big on building libraries and just gathering thought from all over the world. So most of what we know about the ancient Greeks comes to us from Arabic text, which is impressive in its own sense, that we're translating back and forth and getting something that we would somewhat still be able to translate nowadays from the ancient Greek, but we're getting it from Arabic culture, since they were the ones that really put them into order and categorized them and just made these libraries, which we burned down at some point for some reason, because we thought knowledge was not the best ideas for the people to have.
Yeah, it's like a pendulum, historically speaking, that has swung toward or away from intellectualism, where you place a value on knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge, the archival of knowledge, the propagation of it, versus oftentimes seeing that as an evil and being more driven by emotion and strength of convictions. This is another little back and forth that Agent Smith and I have had quite a bit, which is the shift from a skeptical attitude in society, and you value skepticism, versus the value of strength of convictions, where to be skeptical is weakness. And at any given point in history, you can see the dominating faction favoring one over the other in some capacity. So that's another one with Islamic culture, is in this, it's kind of the golden era of Arabic knowledge, where they have a bunch of libraries, they made a bunch of advances in mathematics and this sort of thing, and there are certain demographics, especially in the modern capacity, who are anti-intellectual, saying that you shouldn't be sending people to school and this kind of thing, and it should be more just driven by the original religious text. So it varies a whole bunch, even with Christianity as well. You have certain Christians who are very pro-knowledge, pro-inquiry and introspection, and then others who are very much against that for the average person.
Well, this was in the history a big cut in the early 1900s. So basically post-World War I, where there's been this uprise in the Prussian education system, where you started to educate a lot more people, educating them not necessarily in the way we used to educate people dating back to the Greeks or the Romans, but rather giving them knowledge about certain things, which would be math, language, and making it really specialized on the subject, rather than the approach that the trivium and the quadrivium was following, where basically you teach the the same things, but in a different context that was a lot more focused on critical thinking, on thinking for yourself. And to some degree, it made it a lot easier to educate people, because if you don't make people think for themselves, they ask less questions in class, but rather just learn how to do what you teach them. So I think that there's definitely upsides to that. But also, we're, as a society, losing out on people that are standing up for critical thought due to the system. And I think we're already getting away from it again, where we are getting more back to older styles of teaching, where it's just about basically going back again to rational thought rather than empirical, where it's not based on the knowledge you acquire from your studies, but from the way you reason your way through.
Yeah, there's that swing. There's also, I think, in the US and a lot of other places, a swing away from intellectualism in the past couple decades. One way that they've measured this is the reading level of different presidential speeches. Basically, how informed do you expect your citizen you're speaking to be, and how you are talking to them. So in recent years, it's been a much lower reading level where everyone can understand everything that's going on, but you also sacrifice a lot of detail if you're not going to be specific, and you're not going to challenge your citizens to be aware and thinkers in their own right. And I would hope that it's going to swing back again fairly soon. But yeah, it's an interesting aspect too, because I think when you train your citizen to be thinking critically about stuff, it also makes them more difficult to influence and to drive them in a given direction. Where if you place low value on critical thinking and higher value on emotion and the strength of your convictions, then you can use more emotional appeals rather than rational or logical appeals when you're trying to get them to vote certain ways, to buy certain products, to think certain ways, and that kind of thing. And mass media is it's an interesting new beast that we have to grapple with too, because this kind of long form conversation that we're having now is not as common, I think, for a lot of the online experience. A lot of it is about the fast, flashy, a few seconds of something that really jumps out at you, rather than something that is a slower, longer idea that takes more time to bring to fruition. But you have to listen a lot more. There's more nuance and complexity to it, and it doesn't necessarily push your buttons really hard in any given window of time.
Yeah, I think this is kind of back to the notion that we prefer not to think. It's a real hassle to engage the mind with questions that are difficult to answer and where you might not get to a clear answer. So it's a lot easier if you can just decide, all right, I'm going to go with black on this one and white on the other one. So I think this has to do with a general laziness to think, but also I think we're terrible at conveying joy of an argument. So basically, if you never learn that there is joy in just finding different shades of grace, you'll never do it within the rest of your life. So I think that's something the education system is kind of doing wrong, where it's constantly teaching us something has to be right or wrong. I think multiple choice questions are a really great example of this. So it's either A or B, and you can get the question right or wrong. Everything is pretty much binary in our thinking, and making all this more fleshed out and going to an approach where it's less binary is a difficult thing to do for us.
Yeah, there was actually an anime character that jumped out at me as interesting in that capacity, because a lot of times people are wanting to pass judgment on whether something is good or bad all the time, and there's a given character who would always respond to any situation with, that's interesting. That's interesting. Something really amazing would happen. That's interesting. Something really terrible would happen. That's interesting. This is obviously an extreme for a character concept, but I think a lot of people are not quite prepared or open enough to just leave their response at that. Like, you don't need to be the judge on every single topic that comes up of saying, is this the right thing or the wrong thing, like you're saying, the black and white, but seeing the complexity in a certain light, seeing the depth of it, being interested by that, and seeing the potential to inquire further and how that can give its own reward, rather than necessarily finding the A or B answer.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the notion of to never have faith or never trust your own instincts. Just keep questioning and try to get to an even better solution, and then realize that's still not the solution you were looking for, and just keep going and keep asking questions and looking at it in a new light until at some point your soul migrates into another body.
Yep. Cool. I think we're at a nice rounded off point. We got the big three starters of Greek Western philosophy and thought, talked about mind and this and that, but as we can tell, this has barely kind of scratched the surface of what we could potentially talk about. The chat has been very positive about this format, so it seems like something that people enjoy quite a bit. As a reminder, and you can confirm this, I would guess this takes a fair amount of preparation work too, so it's not like you just flip it on and just go.
It kind of depends on the subject. I think for me, fine. Like when we're talking about broad ideas, knowledgeable enough to talk about anything, but as soon as we're getting into personalities and what they said and how they, what kind of look of the world they had, that's not something that I have constantly on mind. So I need to put a fair amount of research into that to represent them to a degree that kind of honors them enough, and how they viewed the world for me to be comfortably talking about it.
Mm. Well, you know a lot more than me about the history of philosophy, and I think Confucius, you've said, is someone who you've studied a good amount, so we could probably hit some of that in another conversation if you'd be interested.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Yeah, basically what I'm doing is trying to catch up with 2,500 years of Chinese philosophy.
Yeah.
Which is, there's something I wanted to mention, I kind of forgot. So when we're looking about the influence of Plato, there's a really nice quote, and it says that all good philosophy is Plato rightly understood, all bad philosophy is Plato misunderstood. So this was the kind of influence that Plato and his influence on Socrates have basically how it informed on Western philosophy. So to kind of rephrase that, all of Western philosophy is figuratively footnotes to Plato. And interestingly, in Eastern philosophy, it's literally all just footnotes to Confucius, which makes it somewhat easier. So he set up this system which is so complete and so much based in humanity, where you don't need, for example, a god to justify morality, or it's basically a system you can apply always, and it will always work because it's so based in just his experiences.
Yeah, it's a secular system.
Yeah. Yeah, so as you probably heard, I could talk about him all day.
Awesome. Well, we will talk about ideas for a second one. I think this is something that I would definitely like to do again. I have the link for your stream here, guest command. But yeah, I think this is a good duration as well. I think for the purpose of energy and attention, it's pretty similar to the length of a university lecture too. It also gives some time for people to process what happened in a given session and that kind of thing. I did see there were some questions that were dropped in the chat during the discussion. A lot of them were very broad philosophical topics that were kind of off what we've been focusing on, like are we living in a simulation and stuff like that, which that's fun to bring up, but if we jump on every question that comes up, then we're not going to get through the focus material at all. Another question like, what about Nietzsche? Some of this, I would probably recommend you follow EcceFatum stream, and you can ask him when he's live as well. What is your, if you could say, the format of your stream and what you normally broadcast and when?
So I stream every Monday evening, and I'm going to put every in quotes there, but we're focusing on doing it. And it's me and my wife. We talk about, basically she's a coach, so she has a lot more micro-focused view on how to look at all those issues that I'm having this macro view on. So we're just taking a simple idea and talking about it for an hour and see if we'll get somewhere. So we're doing platonic dialogue on ideas that come up and that kind of influence us in our thinking.
Cool. Well, thanks for coming on. This was a fun segment, which we shall do again. Thanks everyone for watching during this. I will get back to some StarCraft stuff, but yeah, awesome stuff, Mr. EcceFatum. Thank you very much for your time and your insight. I feel refreshed and that I have gained information that I did not have before.
All right. Thank you, and good luck. Have fun.
Thank you, sir. GG. Nice. Nice.